When we think of warfare, images of open battlefields might come to mind, but the reality can be altogether different. Enter trench warfare, a method of combat where soldiers hunker down in deep, fortified trenches, shielded from the enemy's fire. This concept is far from a modern invention, with origins tracing back to ancient times, where trenches were used as defensive measures in sieges. However, it wasn't until the 20th century that trench warfare truly came into its own, becoming a defining characteristic of warfare during this period. The sprawling networks of trenches, often stretching for many miles, were a stark contrast to the open battlefields of yesteryears. They provided not only protection but also a strategic advantage, enabling armies to hold their ground for extended periods of time. This form of warfare, while not as visually dramatic as open battle, played a key role in shaping the history of conflicts, particularly in the 20th century. Scene script. Trench warfare didn't just appear overnight. It was the result of a series of technological and strategic developments. Let's rewind the historical clock and take a look at the factors that led to the adoption of trench warfare. A significant catalyst was the evolution in artillery and firearms. In the mid-19th century, the introduction of rifled muskets increased the range and accuracy of infantry weapons. This development made it suicidal for soldiers to charge across open ground as they had done in previous wars. Around the same time, the advent of more powerful and accurate artillery pieces meant that soldiers could be targeted from even further away. These technological shifts drastically changed the nature of warfare. Soldiers who were once the dominant force on the battlefield now found themselves vulnerable to attacks from distances they couldn't counter. The solution? They began digging defensive positions into the earth to protect themselves, the precursor to trench warfare. Two conflicts that stand out as early adopters of this strategy were the Crimean War in the 1850s and the American Civil War in the 1860s. In the Crimean War, the siege of Sevastopol saw both the Russians and the Allies digging extensive trenches and artillery batteries, a foreshadowing of the large-scale trench systems that would be seen later. Meanwhile, the American Civil War saw the extensive use of trenches in the siege of Petersburg. This 9-month standoff is often referred to as the First Modern War because of its innovative use of trenches and fortified positions. Soldiers hunkered down in these ditches, protected from the deadly hail of bullets and artillery shells. These early uses of trenches were relatively rudimentary compared to what was to come. They were essentially defensive positions. Not yet the complex, interconnected networks of trenches that would define World War I. But they marked a significant shift in military strategy, a recognition of the changing realities of warfare in the face of technological advancements. These developments set the stage for the most infamous use of trench warfare, World War I. World War I was a brutal and bloody conflict, and nowhere was this more evident than in the trenches. The Western Front, a war zone stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, was the primary theater for trench warfare during World War I. Here, two opposing forces, the Allies and the Central Powers, dug deep into the earth to create complex networks of trenches, a move driven by the devastating power of modern weaponry. The trenches were not just simple ditches in the ground. They were an intricate system of frontline support and reserve trenches, connected by communication trenches. The frontline trenches, often just 6 feet deep and 6 feet wide, were where the soldiers lived and fought. Behind them, the support and reserve trenches offered a place for rest and replenishment. Living conditions in the trenches were atrocious. Soldiers were crammed into these narrow spaces, living in close quarters with not only their comrades but also the ever-present threat of enemy fire. Rain turned the trenches into muddy swamps, while cold winters froze the ground solid. Soldiers faced a constant struggle against the elements, with hypothermia and trench foot becoming common ailments. In addition to the harsh environmental conditions, soldiers had to contend with the psychological toll of trench warfare. The constant threat of artillery bombardments, sniper fire and surprise attacks created an atmosphere of relentless fear and anxiety. The deafening noise, the smell of gunpowder and death, and the sight of fallen comrades were all part of the daily life in the trenches. The trenches were also a breeding ground for disease. Poor sanitation, a lack of clean water, and the presence of rats and lice led to outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery, typhus, and trench fever. Medical services were often overwhelmed, unable to cope with the sheer number of casualties. Despite these grueling conditions, the soldiers in the trenches showed remarkable resilience. They developed a unique culture of camaraderie, using humor and shared experiences to cope with the horrors of war. They wrote letters home, played cards and music, and even kept pets as a way to maintain their humanity amidst the chaos. Yet the reality remains that trench warfare was a brutal and dehumanizing aspect of World War I. It was a grim testament to the devastating power of modern weaponry and the tragic cost of war. Soldiers were forced to live in squalid conditions, constantly under the threat of death, while the world outside the trenches moved on. The trenches of World War I were a hellish landscape, a testament to the grim realities of modern warfare. They were a place where the ideals of honor and glory were stripped bare, replaced by the stark reality of survival. They were a place where men were reduced to their most basic instincts, where the line between life and death was often just a matter of inches. As with all things in history, trench warfare was not to last forever. The end of the First World War marked the beginning of the end for the widespread use of trenches in warfare. Various factors contributed to this decline, including technological advancements and strategic shifts in military thinking. The years following the First World War were a period of rapid technological innovation. Tanks, which had been introduced towards the end of the war, became more reliable and effective, capable of crossing difficult terrain and breaking through enemy lines. The advent of aircraft and submarines further revolutionized warfare, allowing for attacks from above and below, reducing the effectiveness of trenches as defensive structures. Artillery also saw significant improvements. With increased range and accuracy, artillery could effectively target enemy trenches from a safe distance, making them less viable as defensive positions. The development of chemical weapons also played a role in the decline of trench warfare, as they could be deployed to lethal effect over large areas, making the confined spaces of trenches particularly vulnerable. Beyond technological advancements, changes in military strategy also contributed to the decline of trench warfare. The static, attritional nature of trench warfare was seen as costly and ineffective. Military leaders began to favor more dynamic strategies, such as maneuver warfare, which emphasized movement, speed, and flexibility over static defense. World War II marked a significant turning point. Trench warfare was largely absent from the major theaters of conflict. Instead, the war was characterized by fast, mobile warfare, exemplified by the German blitzkrieg strategy. While trenches were used in some areas, such as the Pacific, they were no longer the defining feature of warfare. The decline of trench warfare marked a new era in the history of conflict, one defined by increased mobility, technology, and strategic complexity. But while the days of trench warfare are largely behind us, its impact on our collective memory persists. The image of the trench, a symbol of the brutality and futility of war, continues to resonate. While trench warfare is no longer the norm, its legacy continues to shape how we view and understand conflict. Trench warfare, a symbol of the brutal nature of conflict, has left an indelible mark on the history of warfare. This military strategy, though antiquated by today's standards, was a game-changer in its prime, dramatically altering the way battles were fought. The rise of trench warfare was a direct result of technological advancements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As rapid-fire machine guns and artillery became the new norm, open-field battles became a recipe for disaster. Soldiers needed a way to protect themselves from this onslaught, and thus, trenches were born. These deep, often muddy and miserable ditches became the new front line, providing a shield from the enemy's relentless firepower. The extensive use of trench warfare in World War I is a testament to its effectiveness during that era. The Western Front, a network of trenches stretching across Belgium and France, was the centerpiece of this grueling and static form of warfare. For 4 long years, from 1914 to 1918, the trenches were home to millions of soldiers, living and dying in conditions that were, in a word, horrific. However, as with all strategies, trench warfare had its day. Its decline was brought about by further technological advancements, particularly the development of tanks and aircraft. These innovations made trenches less effective as protective structures, spelling the end of trench warfare as a dominant military strategy. Though it's a thing of the past, understanding trench warfare helps us better comprehend the human cost of conflict and the lengths to which nations will go to secure victory. Through the lens of history, we see the evolution of warfare, the ingenuity of human beings under extreme conditions, and the tragic cost of global conflict. Trench warfare stands as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of war, a lesson we must never forget.